Welcome to Scary Mary. Find a quiet place, get comfortable, and let your body begin to unwind. Here, true crime stories are told softly to help you drift between fear and calm. These are scary stories for brave dreams. If you enjoy this dark kind of peace, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. What is personality? A convenient illusion, a narrative we tell ourselves from the very beginning of our childhood. A story about a boy or a girl who grew up, learned, loved, suffered, and ultimately became who they are now. This narrative seems continuous and whole to us, like a film reel. Yes, there are bad frames, there are gaps, but it's the same reel. It is stored in a neat little box called I Now Imagine that this film reel is torn apart, not in one place, but in dozens, in hundreds. And someone took these fragments, these scraps of exposed film, and spliced them into new short films. Completely different ones. A tragedy, a comedy, a horror film, a fairy tale, a crime drama. And all these films are projected simultaneously onto a single screen. A screen named Billy Milligan. This is not a metaphor. It is the closest possible description of what William Stanley Milligan felt, or rather, what he did not feel. He was not a spectator in this cinema. He was the very first, the most important film they started shooting, but which was never finished, and then the camera kept working without him, filming other characters who gradually acquired their own lives, their own plots, their own will. The story of Billy Milligan is the story of the collapse of the very concept of I. It poses extremely uncomfortable questions for us, for society, for psychiatrists, for lawyers. Where is the boundary of the human personality? Is our I something given from above, indestructible and whole? Or is it a fragile construct, assembled from memories and experience, which, under sufficient pressure, can be disassembled into its component parts? When Billy Milligan stood trial, it was not one person being judged. In fact, an entire commune residing in one body was on trial. Was the shy, lesbian girl Adalana, desperately searching for love, guilty of rape? Was the fierce Yugoslav Rajin, in whom all the rage from years of humiliation had accumulated, guilty? Was the cold and calculating Arthur, who merely observed the chaos from the sidelines, considering himself above it, guilty? Or was the undesired Billy himself guilty, the original core personality who chose to fade into oblivion, abandoning his mind to the whims of fate? His lawyers argued that he did not commit the crime. His prosecutors insisted that no matter what name he called himself, the body arrested under the name William Milligan was responsible for all actions. This trial was not just a trial of one man. It was a trial of our understanding of human nature. But to get to this trial, to the sensational headlines, to the debates in the scientific community, we must return to the very beginning, to the moment when that very film reel first cracked, to the quiet, unremarkable house where a quiet, domestic war unfolded, the consequences of which were more terrible than any terrorist act, a war whose victim was a little boy, whose mind decided that the only way to survive was to cease to exist. This story is not only about a mental disorder. It is about violence, about memory, about oblivion, about how far a child can go to escape pain, and about the price that awaits him on the other side. This whisper was common to all of them. To Arthur, vainly trying to impose order on the chaos. To Rajan, whose rage was a cry for help. To Christine, who remained a frightened child in a dark basement. To Adelana, who sought salvation from loneliness in the embrace of strangers. They all, each in their own way, were asking for help. But their voices were directed inward, into the labyrinth of their own consciousness, and the echo returned to them distorted and incomprehensible. The outside world saw only the result of this internal collapse. A strange young man with unpredictable behavior, memory lapses, and a set of strange talents. The world saw a criminal, and only a handful of people managed to see behind this facade the tragedy of 24 people locked in a single cage. This story is an attempt not to justify, but to understand, an attempt to walk the dark corridors of his mind, to peer behind doors that should have remained locked forever, and to listen to everyone. Because the verdict the court passed on him was only the beginning of the real sentence, a life sentence in the most complex labyrinth known to mankind, the labyrinth of the self. To understand a labyrinth, one must find its beginning. To comprehend how a single consciousness shatters into 24 fragments, one must see that first shattering blow, the story of William Stanley Morrison, for that was Billy's name at birth, is the story of the systematic destruction of a childhood. It is the chronicle of how a soul, before it had time to grow strong, was trampled by those who were supposed to protect it. February 14, 1955. Miami Beach, Florida. In a world still recovering from war, a boy is born. His mother, Dorothy, is an attractive but unsettled woman dreaming of the stage. She sings in nightclubs. Her life is a kaleidoscope of parties, moves, and fleeting romances. His father, Johnny Morrison, is a comedian whose career is failing. He drowns in alcohol and depression, trying to numb the pain of his own failures. The atmosphere in the Morrison home is saturated with chaos. Stability is an unfamiliar concept. Little Billy falls asleep to the sounds of his parents' quarrels and wakes up to the smell of cheap whiskey. His world lacks safe boundaries. Today they are here, tomorrow in another city, in another dressing room. His toys are empty bottles and poker cards. His babysitters are his parents' casual acquaintances. But even in this chaos, there are moments of warmth. Dorothy, despite all her flaws, sometimes tries to be a mother. She sings lullabies to Billy, tells him fairy tales. Johnny, in rare moments of sobriety, might put his son on his shoulders and give him a ride. These islands of calm become something for Billy to cling to many years later, trying to find justification for what followed. In 1959, the first catastrophe occurs. Johnny Morrison, finally crushed by life and alcohol, commits suicide. For the 4-year-old Billy, this is not just the loss of a father. It is the first encounter with the concept of final, irrevocable disappearance. He doesn't understand where Daddy went. He waits for him, looks for him, but Daddy doesn't return. The first gaping hole appears in his childish picture of the world. A hole that cannot be filled. The widowed Dorothy, left with 3 children and no means of support, desperately seeks salvation. It seems to come in the form of Chalmer Milligan, a former military man, owner of his own business, a chain of costume rental stores. He appears to her as a strong, reliable man who will bring order to her chaotic life. They marry and move to Lancaster, Ohio. At first, everything seems ideal. Chalmer is a strict but fair stepfather. The family finally has its own home, a stable income, a semblance of a normal life. But this idyll does not last long. The mask of well-being begins to slip, revealing Chalmer Milligan's true face, that of a sadist and rapist. The violence begins with discipline. Slaps, cuffs, the belt for the slightest offense. But Chalmer soon finds this insufficient. His sophisticated mind seeks new ways to assert his power over his stepson. He locks Billy in the basement of their farm, a dark, damp place teeming with spiders. First for an hour, then for the whole night. He deprives him of food, humiliates him, forcing him to perform meaningless and humiliating tasks. And then the worst begins. It is in that very basement, in pitch darkness smelling of earth and fear, that Chalmer Milligan begins to systematically rape little Billy. This is not an isolated incident. It is a deliberate, regular campaign of terror, stretching on for years. The consciousness of an 8-year-old child is unable to process such horror. The pain, fear, humiliation, betrayal by an adult who should have protected him. All this forms a cocktail that the psyche cannot bear, and it finds a radical way out. It begins to fragment. At the peak of the violence, when the pain becomes absolutely unbearable, something inexplicable happens. Billy's consciousness does not switch off, it splits. This is not a metaphor, but an accurate description of the psychological process of dissociation. The brain, unable to integrate the traumatic experience, creates separate mental structures that take on the unbearable fragments of reality. The first to appear are the most vulnerable, most childlike parts of his psyche, those closest to the original I of Billy. Sean, a hard of hearing, shy 3-year-old boy, he becomes the keeper of pain. His psychological deafness is a defense mechanism, allowing him not to hear the insults and threats. When Chalmer comes, Billy's consciousness recedes, and Sean comes to the fore. He cries, he endures. He takes the full physical blow. His existence is the embodiment of pure, unmediated childhood pain. Christine, a fragile 3-year-old girl with Down syndrome. As perceived by the other alters, she is the keeper of innocence. When it becomes too painful for Sean, Christine takes his place. She does not understand the nature of the violence being committed. Her consciousness retreats into an created inner world where she draws flowers and butterflies with chalk. While the abuse happens to the body, she takes on the emotional shock and the feeling of dirt, preserving an illusion of purity. But to function in the outside world, full of daily challenges, they needed not only those who could endure pain, they needed personalities capable of acting, analyzing, and defending. Arthur, a rational, cold, highly intellectual Englishman, a self-taught man interested in science and medicine, speaking with a flawless Oxford accent, he becomes the administrator of the system. He is the first to realize the existence of the other personalities. Using his logic, he studies them, tries to classify them, and establishes rules. It is Arthur who decides who can come out to the light, gain control of the body, and when. He is the embodiment of a desperate attempt to impose order on chaos, to replace emotional horror with an intellectual structure. Rajan Vadiskavanish, abbreviated Rajan, the keeper of hatred, a strong, agile, cruel Yugoslav with an accent, an expert in survival and weapons. All the rage, all the anger that Billy could not express, became concentrated in Rajan. He hates Chalmer with a pathological hatred. He hates the world that allowed this to happen. His task is to protect the system at any cost, even through cruelty. He is a lump of unexpressed aggression, necessary for survival. Tommy, the keeper of escape, a teenager fascinated by electronics, lockpicking, and magic tricks. He hates any bars and restrictions, which is a direct projection of his situation. It is often Tommy who takes control when they need to run away from home or avoid punishment. His skills are a direct consequence of the constant feeling of being trapped. the need for freedom that was stolen from him in the basement. Alan, a joker, a manipulator, a charming rogue. He knows how to charm, lie, and talk his way out of difficult situations. He comes out when they need to make a good impression on teachers or social workers. He is the social mask the system puts on for the outside world, a tool for mimicry in an environment perceived as hostile. The process of forming new personalities was not instantaneous. Each alter was born in response to a specific, unbearable need or trauma. It was a finely tuned mechanism of psychological defense that developed over years. Phil, a Brooklynite with criminal tendencies, appeared in response to the need to commit petty thefts, to survive, to get food or money when Chalmer deprived him of everything. Kevin, a safecracker, planning robberies, a more advanced version of Phil, specializing in complex criminal tasks. April, a domineering lesbian who hates men. Her emergence is connected to the need to psychologically distance herself from male aggression and create an image of a strong, independent woman. Steve, a mimic who copies others' manners and voices, arose as a tool for social adaptation, allowing him to adjust to different situations. Each personality possessed its own age, from 3 years for Christine to 23. For Rajan, nationality and accent physiological characteristics. Different IQs, allergies, eyesight, talents, and skills, memories, and traumas. The alters existed not only in the external world, they lived in a complex inner space they called the spot. It was a mental construct where each personality had its own room, and the most influential, like Arthur, observed what was happening through a sort of screen. When one of the alters controlled the body, the others were in the spot, in varying states of activity. Some slept, others observed, others went about their business. Arthur, as the administrator, could decide who was allowed to come out, creating a complex system of internal hierarchy. This inner world was both a prison and a refuge, a place to hide from the horrors of external reality, but also a place of eternal confinement. For the outside world, Billy Milligan was a problematic, unpredictable teenager with serious behavioral disorders. His school life became a nightmare, not only for him, but also for his teachers. Math teachers couldn't understand how a student who brilliantly solved complex equations yesterday, Arthur, couldn't add 2 simple numbers today. Sean, the art teacher, was amazed by the contrast between childish scribbles, Christine, and professional sketches, Tommy. In PE, he could demonstrate incredible agility, Rajan, and the next day be completely clumsy. But the most terrifying thing for Billy himself was the phenomenon of lost time. He could wake up in an unfamiliar part of the city, with no memory of how he got there, with bruises and scrapes on his body, not knowing their origin, with strange objects in his pockets, hearing from classmates about his own actions, which he had no memory of for him. These were not just memory lapses. They were literal gaps in existence. Each such episode intensified his alienation from himself and from the world around him. Social isolation worsened. Peers teased him as crazy. Teachers considered him incapable or a malingerer. Even his own stepsisters didn't understand what was happening to their brother. The position of Billy's mother, Dorothy Milligan, remains one of the most controversial aspects of this story. How much did she know? Could she have prevented the tragedy? On one hand, Dorothy was herself a victim of Chalmer. She suffered psychological and possibly physical abuse. She was afraid of her husband and financially dependent on him. On the other hand, the numerous oddities in her son's behavior, his sudden character changes, nightmares, fear of his stepfather, all these were obvious signals that she chose to ignore or explain away as a difficult age. Perhaps her silence was a form of psychological self-defense. To acknowledge the horror happening to her son would have meant acknowledging her own failure as a mother and wife. By the time he reached adulthood, the personality system of Billy Milligan was a complex but fragile conglomeration. Core of the system: Arthur, logic and control; Rajan, protection and aggression; child alters: Sean, Christine, David, keeper of pain, criminal alters; Phil, Kevin, social alters; Alan, Steve, creative alters; Tommy, Christopher, musician. There was no central, integrating personality. Billy himself, the undesired, was in a state of constant sleep, appearing only episodically. The system functioned on a survival principle, but was incapable of healthy social adaptation. The pain, rage, and fear accumulated over the years created a dangerous potential that was bound to find an outlet sooner or later. To understand what was happening to Billy Milligan, one must turn to the contemporary. For that period, psychiatric understanding of dissociative disorders, dissociative identity disorder, in the 1970s, known as multiple personality disorder, forms when three key factors combine: early and repeated trauma, beginning before the age of 7-9, when the personality is still forming; lack of a safe attachment, the inability to receive support and protection from significant adults; biological predisposition, individual characteristics of the brain and nervous system. In Billy's case, all three factors were present to the maximum degree. Systematic sexual abuse by his stepfather created unbearable trauma. The alcoholism and depression of his biological father And then the passivity of his mother deprived him of a safe attachment. Neurobiological aspects. Research shows that severe childhood trauma leads to a literal splitting of the neural networks responsible for integrating experience instead of a unified system of memory and identity. Isolated islands of consciousness form. Psychological mechanisms. Each new alter performed a specific defensive function, took on pain. Sean, David, preserved innocence. Christine expressed aggression. Rajan provided intellectual control. Arthur ensured social adaptation. Alan, by age 15. Billy's inner world was a complex ecosystem with a clear, though fragile, structure. The board of directors, Arthur, Rajan, and several other adult alters made major decisions. The children's group, Sean, Christine, and others bore the main burden of the trauma. The performers, criminal and social alters, ensured survival in the external world. The observers, some personalities, only passively observed events. A critical problem was the lack of communication between different groups. Arthur understood the existence of the others, but many alters were unaware of each other. This created constant internal conflict and unpredictable behavior. The 1970s. Billy Milligan is in his 20s, outwardly an ordinary young man trying to find his place in life. Inwardly, a battlefield where 24 warring armies are fighting an endless war for control over a single territory. His body, these were years of wandering, odd jobs, and constant run-ins with the law. But now, these were no longer childish misdeeds, but serious crimes. The system created for survival began to work against itself and against society. After leaving the Milligan household, Billy tried to build an independent life. But any attempt at stability collapsed due to the internal chaos. Job loss. He could work as a gifted artist, Tommy, but the next day show up to work as a crying child, Sean, or an aggressive type, Rajan. Employers didn't understand these metamorphoses and fired him. Housing problems. He constantly lost apartments, either because he couldn't pay rent when control was with the child alters, or due to conflicts with neighbors, Rajan or Phil, criminal activity. To survive, the criminal alters Phil, Kevin, sometimes Adelana, committed store robberies, car theft, petty theft. Money obtained by one alter could be spent by another on completely useless things. During this period, the following became especially active. Adelana, a 19-year-old lesbian, quiet and shy. She felt acute loneliness and a longing for human closeness, but didn't know how to express these feelings in a healthy way. Phil, a specialist in street crimes, always looking for easy money. Kevin, a planner who devised schemes for more complex robberies. Arthur tried to maintain order, but his power was limited. Rajan, filled with years of accumulated rage, was increasingly slipping out of control. By the mid-1970s, the internal tension in the system had reached a critical point. Arthur, who had always advocated strict control and concealment of their condition from the outside world, began to lose influence. His rational arguments couldn't withstand Rajan's primal rage and Adalana's despair. Rajan increasingly took control in situations he perceived as threatening. His outbursts of anger became more cruel and unpredictable. He began carrying a weapon and looking for reasons to confront, seeing every stranger as a potential enemy. Adalana sank into deep depression. Her need for emotional closeness and physical affection became unbearable. In her loneliness, she began taking risks, contacting strangers in search of a comfort that never came. The criminal alters, Phil, Kevin, acted more and more boldly. They moved from petty theft to armed robbery. They weren't concerned with consequences. They lived for the here and now, not thinking about a future that, for them, essentially didn't exist. At this time, new, even more specialized alters appeared in the system. Jason, a pressure valve, who took on particularly strong surges of rage, thereby preventing even more serious explosions. Samuel, a religious fanatic, who saw their suffering as God's punishment and tried to atone for it through prayer and self-flagellation. The system was becoming a powder keg, ready to explode from the slightest spark. October 1977 became a turning point, when the internal crisis of the system spilled out with destructive force. The chain of events leading to the arrest reveals the tragic mechanics of the disorder. October 3, 1977. The kidnapping on the Ohio State University campus. The initiators were April and Kevin. April, driven by hatred for the male world and a desire to dominate, developed the plan. Kevin, as the planning specialist, assessed its feasibility. Their target, a young nurse, was not chosen by chance. April saw in her a symbol of the well-being that was denied to her. They stalked the woman, forced her into a van, and drove off. However, the plan began to fall apart almost immediately. Panic erupted inside the system. Alan briefly took control, trying to calm the woman and find a peaceful way out. His attempts were clumsy and only increased the victim's fear. Rajan, sensing threat and chaos, burst out. His rage, accumulated over years in the basement of the Milligan house, was unleashed on the unsuspecting woman. It was he who committed the act of violence, acting out of a mixture of blind fury and a distorted understanding of revenge. At some point, Adalana gained control. Her subsequent actions were dictated not by malicious intent, but by a deep, painful loneliness and a distorted search for intimacy. In a situation of absolute power over another person, this was not a coldly calculated crime. It was a chaotic outburst of different, contradictory motives and impulses, replacing each other within a short period. The victim, who survived because she was found in time, later described the attacker as several different people in one body, whose behavior and voice changed drastically. Just 4 days later, having no money and in a state of complete disorganization, the system again turned to crime. This time, the initiative came from Phil and Kevin. They needed money to flee. The robbery of the clinic at Ohio State University was more professional, but again accompanied by glitches. One of the employees later testified that the armed robber suddenly began acting strangely soft, almost apologizing, before becoming aggressive again. This was a moment when Alan briefly took control. The police, investigating both cases, quickly identified Billy Milligan's van. The descriptions given by the victims, though contradictory, generally matched. On October 27, 1977, less than a month after the robbery, Billy Milligan was arrested at his home. The arrest was a shock to many of the alters. Some, like Christine and Sean, didn't understand what was happening at all. Arthur realized the seriousness of the situation, but was powerless. Rajan reacted with rage and resistance. Billy himself, the undesired, was virtually absent. Their shared life, already chaotic, was now hurtling into an abyss. But they didn't yet know that this arrest would mark the beginning of the most publicized trial of their life and force the whole world to ponder the nature of human personality and guilt, to understand the October 1977 crimes. One must analyze not the actions of a single person, but the collapse of a complex system that had existed for decades under extreme stress. By October 1977, the system was in a state of extreme financial need. The criminal alters saw crime as the only means of survival, while the more passive personalities could not offer alternative solutions. This kaleidoscopic change of pilots turned the crime into a chaotic process where each personality pursued its own, often contradictory, goals. The moment of arrest and subsequent confinement in the Franklin County Jail was a catastrophe for the already fragile system. For each alter, it meant a unique ordeal. The arrest and jail exacerbated the internal rift. Trust between the alters, already fragile, was undermined. Some blamed others for getting them all into trouble. Arthur tried to hold internal councils, but they often ended in chaos and mutual recriminations. The pressure from both outside and inside reached such intensity that the system was on the verge of complete disintegration. The first weeks after the arrest were a time of complete misunderstanding between Billy Milligan and the legal system, judges, prosecutors, and even his first public defenders encountered behavior that didn't fit any standard framework. Inadequacy of the initial defense. The public defender assigned to Billy initially built a defense on a standard scheme, trying to challenge the evidence or find procedural errors. He did not attach importance to the oddities in his client's behavior, attributing them to stress or an attempt to malinger. Failed interrogations. During official interrogations, different alters gave contradictory statements. Alan might confidently deny the charges, while Sean, coming out at the wrong time, would start crying and confess to anything just to stop the pressure. Investigators recorded these inconsistencies as proof of deceit, not understanding their true nature. Court reaction. At preliminary hearings, judges faced a defendant who might aggressively argue with the prosecutor one day, Rajan, and timidly ask for his mom the next, Christine. This was perceived as contempt of court and led to stricter measures. The turning point came when the case was taken over by Dorothy Twyford, an experienced and principled public defender. Unlike her predecessors, she did not ignore the oddities in her client's behavior. Carefully observing Billy in jail, she noticed sharp changes in handwriting in prison notes, drastic changes in speech patterns, and vocabulary episodes where Billy seemed not to recognize her or remember their previous conversations. Twyford suspected she was dealing not with malingering, but with a serious mental disorder. It was she who insisted on a full forensic psychiatric evaluation, despite the skepticism of the court and prosecution. This decision became a pivotal point in the entire case. Daily life in the Franklin County Jail was a harsh trial for each of the alters, forced to exist under a strict routine and constant supervision. While Billy was in jail awaiting evaluation, the first information about the strange prisoner began to leak to the press. Journalists, not understanding the essence of what was happening, created two opposing images. A genius malingerer. Pieces in this vein portrayed Billy as a calculating criminal, play-acting a mental illness with the help of acting talent, an innocent victim. A few articles, based on information from the defense, painted a portrait of a man with a severe mental disorder in need of treatment, not punishment. Public opinion in Columbus leaned towards the first version. City residents, frightened by the brutality of the crimes, were willing to believe any version except one that suggested the insanity of the perpetrator. The realization of the seriousness of the charges and the growing public attention created a new kind of stress within the system. Arthur understood that traditional defense methods wouldn't work. Rajan saw in what was happening confirmation of his view of the world as a place where the strong always persecute the weak. Adelana completely lost hope for understanding and acceptance. It was at this moment, in desperation, that the system began to develop new, more complex adaptation mechanisms, a process that would later lead to the emergence of additional alters specializing specifically in interaction with the legal system. Understanding the inevitability of a deep psychiatric evaluation, the system began a spontaneous internal reorganization. This process occurred on several levels. The court's decision to grant Dorothy Twyford's motion for a comprehensive forensic psychiatric evaluation was a moment of truth for all parties involved. In December 1977, 2 months after the arrest, a final decision was made to refer William Milligan for evaluation by Dr. Willis C. Riskin. No one then suspected that this would lead to one of the most famous and controversial trials in American legal history. December 1977. Dr. Willis C. Riskin, an experienced psychiatrist with a reputation as a skeptic, prepares for his first meeting with William Milligan. He is critical, expecting to encounter an artful malingerer. What will be revealed to him during the months-long evaluation will forever change his professional views and become the basis for a trial that will make history. Dr. Riskin's first meetings with Billy resembled an attempt to conduct a census in a constantly shifting demographic situation. Dr. Riskin's scientific conservatism collided with a clinical reality that did not fit standard diagnostic frameworks. Realizing the uniqueness of the case, Dr. Riskin employed hypnotherapy as a primary research tool. Under hypnosis, the inner world of the system was revealed, astounding in its complexity. Parallel to the psychiatric evaluation, the police investigation continued. Detectives faced a paradox. The evidence clearly pointed to Billy Milligan, but the motivation for the crimes remained unexplained. By the spring of 1978, the legal system faced an unprecedented problem: how to qualify the actions of a person if different crimes were committed by different personalities, unaware of each other's existence. The summer of 1978 was spent in intense preparation for the trial. Both sides developed unique strategies with no precedent in legal practice. Fall 1978. The Franklin County courtroom is packed. Journalists, psychiatrists, curious citizens, all eager to see the man with multiple personalities. The atmosphere resembles a circus, show more than a judicial proceeding. The climax of the trial was Dr. Willis C. Risking's hours-long testimony. Using charts, session recordings, and detailed explanations, he gave the jury a tour of Billy Milligan's consciousness. Dr. Risking confidently parried, citing specific, documented examples of physiological differences between the alter's different blood pressure, different reactions to medication that were impossible to fake. The judge enters the packed room. The air is thick with curiosity and anticipation. The jurors' faces show a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They must decide not just the fate of a man, but confront a challenge to the very concept of human personality. And at the center of this maelstrom sits he, William Milligan, or rather, those who live in his body. They are frightened. They are confused. Some of them don't understand where they are or why all these people are looking at them. Jury selection dragged on for weeks. Both the defense and the prosecution were looking not just for impartial, but for truly thoughtful people capable of withstanding the tension of an extraordinary trial. In the end, 12 people were chosen: teachers, accountants, mechanics, housewives. Ordinary people whose ordinary lives were about to collide with the extraordinary. Their first acquaintance with the case was a shock. The prosecutors spoke of rape and robbery, the defense of abasement, of torture, of a shattered child's mind. The jurors listened, and their faces showed a struggle between natural disgust for the crime and growing compassion for the defendant, whose life, if the defense was to be believed, had been one long nightmare. Every day of the trial, they watched Billy intently. They saw him sitting with his head down, almost motionless. And then, how his posture, facial expression, even the direction of his gaze would suddenly change. They weren't experts, but their common intuition suggested, this is not an act. Something very real and very terrible is happening to this man. When Dr. Risking took the stand, dead silence fell in the room. He spoke not as a lawyer, but as a scientist, an explorer discovering uncharted lands. He wasn't asking for acquittal. He was asking for understanding. He talked about Sean, who took the pain, about Christine, who hid in her inner world from the horror, about Arthur, desperately trying to impose order on the chaos, about Rajan, in whom the rage for all the endured humiliation seethed. He spoke of them not as symptoms, but as people. And at some point, it became clear in the courtroom. It was not one person on trial. This body housed an entire family of traumatized souls, and each bore its own cross. The prosecutor, a pragmatic and tough man, fiercely attacked Risking's testimony. He spoke of simulation, of manipulation, of a criminal finding a brilliant way to evade responsibility. He demanded proof, ironclad and irrefutable. And then Dr. Riskin did something no one expected. With the court's permission, he asked Billy to relax. And the frozen hall saw, right before their eyes, the defendant's voice change from timid and halting. It became cold and precise, with a clear British accent. It was Arthur. He calmly and methodically answered a few technical questions about the internal structure of their system. And then, for a moment, the voice changed again, becoming childlike and frightened. It was Christine. She asked if she could go home now. A tomb-like silence hung in the room. No actor in the world could have transformed so instantly and so convincingly. The jurors were not seeing a performance. They were seeing pain, living, real, unbearable pain, bursting out in different voices. The demonstration of the personality switches in the courtroom hung in the air as a heavy, indisputable fact. But behind the legal battles, the expert disputes, all these procedural subtleties, two people were present in the courtroom for whom this trial was not an abstract legal proceeding, but an exposed nerve of their own lives. Dorothy Milligan, and, albeit invisibly, the shadow of Chalmer Milligan. Dorothy Milligan sat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She listened to Dr. Riskin's testimony about the years of systematic abuse, the basement, the torture. And with every word she seemed to shrink, crumpling from shame and grief. What did she know? What could she have prevented? These questions hung in the air, though none of the lawyers asked them directly. Was she an accomplice who turned a blind eye to the nightmare for the sake of illusory well-being? Or was she another victim of Chalmer, a frightened and broken woman who couldn't find the strength to protect her own son? When the defense took the floor and began presenting evidence of Chalmer's cruelty, Dorothy couldn't bear it and left the courtroom, covering her face with a handkerchief. Her exit was more eloquent than any words. It was a silent admission, an admission that the nightmare described in court was real. And her silence of a decade ago had been a sentence for her own child. Chalmer Milligan was not physically present in the courtroom, but his shadow lay over the entire trial. He was that bad man in the basement Christine cried about. He was the source of Reagan's rage. He was the demon that tore a little boy's mind to pieces. Every mention of him, every description of his actions, caused a visible reaction in the defendant when the prosecutor, trying to challenge the disorder theory, skeptically asked, "And we are to believe that all of this is because of some mythical childhood abuse?" At that very moment, Reagan might seize control of the body. His face would contort into a grimace of pure, primal hatred. The guards had to be on alert. Chalmer Milligan, unwittingly, became the chief witness for the prosecution. For the defense, the more fiercely the prosecutor tried to dismiss the trauma as a cause, the more obvious its monstrous reality became to the jury. They were not seeing a simulation. They were seeing a living wound that bled right before their eyes every time someone touched on the topic of Billy's childhood. The defense attorneys masterfully used this. They weren't just presenting medical reports. They were telling a story about a boy who was tortured, a boy who was broken, a boy whose mind chose to shatter into fragments rather than endure the unbearable. And at the center of this story, as the main villain, stood the ghost of Chalmer Milligan. After the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. If earlier there was a sensational curiosity, now a heavy, almost funereal seriousness prevailed. The jurors, returning to their seats, looked at the defendant differently, not as a curiosity, but as a tragedy. Dr. Riskeen's demonstration and Dorothy Milligan's silent confession had done their job. Now came the most difficult part, to legally formalize this human understanding within the framework of the law. The defense called its final witnesses, Billy's school teachers, neighbors, casual acquaintances. Their testimonies, seemingly disjointed like pieces of a mosaic, began to form a single picture. A primary school teacher, Mrs. Elsie, in a trembling voice, recalled a boy who could be happily playing with other children at recess. And 5 minutes later, in class, sit staring into space, not responding to his name, as if switched off. She attributed it to fatigue or a lack of attention. A neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, told how she once saw Billy rummaging in their shed. When she called out to him, he looked up at her with an absolutely empty, unseeing gaze and asked in a thin, childlike voice, "Have you seen my kitten?" An hour later, she saw him again, rapidly repairing a bicycle with a concentrated, adult expression. These stories, for years considered just oddities, now, in the context of Dr. Riskeen's testimony, took on an ominous meaning. They painted a portrait not of a criminal, but of a lost, frightened child who never managed to grow into a single, whole person because the world he lived in was unbearable for him. The day of closing arguments arrived. The prosecutor and the defender stood before the jury, embodying two completely different views of the same case. The prosecutor, pointing at Billy, spoke of the victims, of the woman who endured the hell of kidnapping and rape, of the clinic employees held at gunpoint. "Do not let this man," he thundered, "hide behind a convenient fiction of multiple personalities. The law must be blind. The law must be harsh. And the law says, this body committed the crimes, and this body must be punished." When Dorothy Twyford took the floor, the room fell silent. She did not shout. She spoke calmly, but every phrase was filled with steel. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "the prosecutor asks you to condemn the body. But we do not judge the body. We judge the mind. We judge the soul. And what can you say about a soul that was torn to pieces before it had time to form?" She looked around at the jurors. "My client, William Milligan, died many years ago. He died in that basement at the hands of a man who was supposed to be his father. And what you see before you is his tombstone. It is a crypt in which the fragments of who he could have become are walled up. Can you condemn a tombstone? Can you punish a crypt?" Her speech lasted almost an hour. She did not ask for the crimes to be forgiven. She asked for mercy for their cause. She asked them to recognize that the real criminal in this courtroom was the absent Chalmer Milligan, and Billy, his primary and most lasting victim, December 1978. The Franklin County courtroom held its breath in anticipation. The 12 jurors took their seats. Their faces were tired and expressionless. They had taken upon themselves the burden of a decision that went far beyond an ordinary verdict. They had to not just determine guilt or innocence, but give a legal assessment to the very phenomenon of human consciousness. The judge addressed the jury foreman. "Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The room stopped breathing. The clerk took the piece of paper from the foreman's hands and unfolded it. His voice, usually monotone, trembled as he read. "On the charge of robbery, we find the defendant not guilty by reason of insanity." A murmur ran through the room, but was immediately interrupted by the clerk's voice reading the next charge. The result was the same, and the next, and the last. William Stanley Milligan was found not guilty on all counts due to the presence of a severe mental disorder, dissociative identity disorder. For the first time in American legal history, this diagnosis became the basis for an acquittal. The reaction in the room was explosive. Journalists rushed for the exits to be the first to report the sensation. The victims' relatives cried out in fury and disappointment. The defense attorneys hugged, and Billy himself sat motionless. He seemed not to understand the significance of what was happening, or understood all too well. The verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity did not mean freedom. It meant only a change of prison, according to Ohio law. Billy Milligan was subject to involuntary hospitalization in a specialized psychiatric institution until his condition was deemed safe for society. The judge ordered him sent to one of the state's strictest and most notorious hospitals, Lima State Hospital. The transfer to Lima State in January 1979 was a new, perhaps even more severe, trial for the system. If the Franklin County Jail was a place of temporary confinement, the psychiatric hospital, with its endless corridors, the smell of disinfectant, and barred windows, became a symbol of permanent confinement. Lima State Hospital became for the system not just a hospital, but a new, exhausting battlefield. The strict routine, chemical treatments, and constant supervision descended upon the fragile internal ecosystem like a hurricane. Entry into the new, extremely stressful environment provoked an unprecedented crisis within the system. The hospital, meant to treat, with its rigid regime and lack of understanding of the disorder's nature, essentially worsened Billy's condition, pushing the system toward complete disintegration. Treatment at Lima State quickly turned into a form of torture for Billy's fragmented consciousness. Doctors, not understanding the nature of his condition, applied standard methods for the time that only exacerbated the internal chaos. When medication failed to calm the patient, more radical methods were employed. The change of attending physician in Midminus 1979 became a turning point. Dr. David Call, unlike his predecessors, did not immediately reject the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. After carefully studying the medical history and Dr. Riskine's report, he realized he was dealing with a unique case requiring a completely different approach. Dr. Call radically changed tactics. Instead of trying to forcibly subdue the manifestations of the disorder, he decided to acknowledge the reality of all the personalities and begin working with the system as a single, but complexly organized patient. The new approach began to yield the first tentative results. The system, feeling that it was finally not being broken, but being understood, began to gradually calm down. It was a slow, difficult process, full of breakdowns and setbacks. But for the first time in many years, a glimmer of hope appeared for the system that its existence did not necessarily have to be an eternal nightmare. Dr. Call's work with the Milligan system entered a new phase. After months of establishing basic trust and stabilizing the condition, it was time for a more complex task: building bridges between the alters isolated from each other and beginning the process of their cooperation. And, in the distant future, possible integration. Dr. Call understood that the key to improving the system's condition lay not in suppressing the alters, but in establishing conscious interaction between them. He began to apply specialized techniques, many of which were innovative for the time. As therapy deepened and internal communication improved, personalities emerged that even Arthur knew only by hearsay, or didn't know at all. The system turned out to be even more complex than initially assumed. relying on the growing internal cooperation, and with Billy's permission, through the Council of Altars, Dr. Call began cautious experiments with temporary, controlled integration, a process where several altars voluntarily merged their consciousness for a short time. The first such experiment was conducted between Arthur and Tommy. Both were adult and relatively stable altars. The process was painful and frightening for both. They described it as merging two rivers, initial chaos and resistance, and then an unexpected feeling of expanded awareness and access to combined skills and memories. This experience, though temporary, showed several key altars that integration was not destruction, but unification. That while remaining themselves, they could gain access to the strengths and knowledge of others. This reduced the initial fear of the ultimate goal of therapy. While painstaking therapeutic work was going on within the walls of Lima State, the Billy Milligan case continued to stir minds outside. By the end of 1979, William Milligan was still a patient at Lima State, but his inner world and external prospects no longer seemed like a hopeless life trap. For the first time in many years, the system had a goal, not just to survive, but to change. The early 1980s, William Milligan is still within the walls of Lima State, but his case is no longer confined to the intensive care ward. It has become public property, a subject of scientific debate and legal battles. The system, having achieved its first stable successes in therapy, enters a long and exhausting period of struggle for the right to less strict confinement, and ultimately for freedom, under pressure from Dr. Call and defenders, who argued that the harsh conditions of Lima State no longer corresponded to the patient's condition and were even harmful to therapeutic progress. A series of court hearings began on the possibility of transferring Billy to another, more open psychiatric clinic. The process dragged on for months. Each hearing was a stress for the system, provoking regression and internal conflicts. Hope gave way to disappointment as transfer petitions were denied. After an exhausting legal battle in 1981, the court finally decided to transfer Billy Milligan from Lima State to Harding Hospital in Warren, an institution with a less strict regime. This transfer was not just a change of location, but a symbolic transition to a new phase of life, a phase where the main struggle was no longer defense against the system, but an attempt to find one's place within it. Harding Hospital, though still a closed institution, provided patients with significantly more autonomy. For the system, this was both a blessing and a new trial. It was during this period that Billy Milligan's story reached the national level and gained truly worldwide fame, largely thanks to writer Daniel Keyes, author of Flowers for Algernon. Despite the progress and relative stability, the path to final release proved long. Billy's lawyers had to go through a series of new court hearings to prove that their client no longer posed a threat. The mid-1980s, Billy Milligan becomes not just a patient, but a cultural phenomenon. His case transcends psychiatry and jurisprudence, generating broad public debate about the nature of evil, responsibility, and the capabilities of the human psyche. Meanwhile, inside the system, intense, invisible work is underway to build a new modus vivendi, a form of existence that would allow them, if not to merge into a single whole, then at least to coexist in relative peace with the outside world under the guidance of Dr. Call. And thanks to the growing influence of the teacher, fundamental changes occur in the system. If initially the alters were disparate survival mechanisms, they now slowly turn into a kind of collective, forced to negotiate and cooperate. The worldwide fame that came after the publication of Daniel Keyes' book hit the system like an avalanche. By the end of the 1980s, Dr. David Call, who played a key role in stabilizing Billy, gradually stepped back from active management of the case. His departure became a new trauma for the system, comparable to the loss of a support. The search began for a new therapist capable of understanding the system's unique dynamics. This transitional period was accompanied by inevitable regression, a surge of internal anxiety, and new searches for internal balance without their main pilot in the external world. Uncertainty once again loomed over the system, forcing it once again to prove its competence to new people on whom its future depended. Late 1980s, early 1990s, the case of Billy Milligan finally outgrows the framework of an individual story, becoming a focal point for discussions about the very nature of the human. The boundaries of responsibility and the capabilities of the psyche, the internal work of the system to achieve some degree of freedom and stability, continues against the backdrop of this deafening external polemic. The publication of Daniel Keyes' book and the subsequent notoriety of the Milligan case caused a tectonic shift in the psychiatric community's attitude towards dissociative disorders. Meanwhile, the legal battle for Billy's final release from state custody entered its decisive phase. By the early 1990s, he had spent nearly 10 years in various closed institutions. In 1991, after 14 years spent in prisons and psychiatric hospitals, William Milligan was released into the community under strict supervision. It was not a triumph, but a cautious, conditional entry into a world that had changed greatly during his absence. But his past, his fame, and the very nature of his disorder made this incredibly difficult. Employers were afraid to hire him. People either idolized him as a celebrity or feared him as a maniac. Freedom turned out to be a new, unfamiliar stress for the system. The lack of a rigid hospital routine required the highest degree of self-organization from the Council of Altars, which was not always sufficient. Periods of relative stability began to alternate with episodes of internal imbalance. When the Altars, deprived of external pressure, began to conflict for control over this new, incomprehensible freedom dreamed of for so long, turned out to be not a point of arrival, but the beginning of a new, even more complex journey, a journey to find oneself in a world that did not know how to accept a man who was simultaneously a criminal, a victim, a patient, and a symbol. The 1990s and 2000s. William Milligan is formally free. He tries to live, but freedom for a person whose consciousness is a multi-voiced choir proves to be a trial. In its complexity, not inferior to imprisonment, this is a story not of healing, but of the search for a fragile, temporary modus vivendi, a way of existing in a world that will never understand his inner structure. From the moment of his release, Billy Milligan found himself trapped by his own notoriety. His face was known to millions, his story parsed into quotes. Freedom did not bring inner peace. On the contrary, the absence of rigid external hospital frameworks provoked new internal storms. By the 2010s, Billy Milligan's health began to decline. Years of stress, medication, internal struggle, and social isolation had taken their toll. On December 12, 2014, at the age of 59, William Stanley Milligan died in a nursing home in Columbus, Ohio, from cancer. His death was the final chord of one of the most incredible and tragic lives in the history of psychiatry. He died as enigmatic as he lived. Questions remained that would never be answered. The last decade of Billy Milligan's life was marked by a gradual decline, both physical and, perhaps, internal. The freedom he had fought for so long turned out to be not a liberation, but another form of confinement within his own incurability and the expectations of a society that never managed to accept him. His later years were a slow, painful farewell to a world he never understood and which never understood him. As the end of physical life approached, the question arose of the fate of the 24 personalities that inhabited Billy's consciousness. According to a few trusted sources and fragmentary information from his last interviews, by the end of his days, the system had undergone significant changes. With the death of Billy Milligan in December 2014, the debate about his case did not subside, but moved into a new plane, the historical and scientific. His legacy remains deeply controversial and continues to influence psychiatry, jurisprudence, and popular culture. The case of William Milligan, in the final analysis, offers no simple answers. It poses eternal existential questions for which science still has no definitive answer. Billy Milligan died, taking the final answers with him. He left behind a story that is simultaneously a cautionary tale about the fragility of the child's psyche, a testament to the incredible strength of the human spirit for survival, and a troubling question about the limits of our ability to judge one another. His life became a mirror in which society saw its deepest fears and its most burning curiosity about the mysteries of the human mind. And in this mirror, we, as a society, saw far from our best traits: the readiness to condemn, the inability to understand, the thirst for sensation, and the eternal desire to find simple answers to the most complex questions. The story of William "Billy" Milligan has ended, but the story he left behind continues to live, acquiring new meanings, interpretations, and questions. It no longer belongs to him alone. It has become part of our collective consciousness, a modern myth, a parable about human nature that we will retell for many years to come. What remains after him? Not just a medical record or a court case. A complex, multifaceted legacy remains, which can be viewed from an infinite number of perspectives. So who was William Stanley Milligan in the end? A genius malingerer who fooled the best experts for decades. A victim of monstrous abuse whose mind paid a terrible price for survival. A pioneer of new frontiers of the human psyche, or a convenient symbol onto which we projected all our fears and doubts about the nature of our own I. Perhaps the only correct answer is that he was all of these at once. He was a mirror, and when we look into the story of his life, we see in it not him, but ourselves, our own complexity, our own contradictions, our own, hidden from everyone, multiplicity. His 24 voices have fallen silent, but their echo will resonate for a very long time, forcing us to ask ourselves the most uncomfortable questions. And in this, perhaps, lies his main purpose: to be the one who made humanity doubt the simplicity of itself.